It's always a good sign when it takes a few minutes for things to quiet down, because that tells us there's a lot of interaction and engagement, and it's wonderful to see you all here for our very first Amram of the 2023-2024 season. Excited to have you all with us. I know we have a few family members of the Goodman family, extended family, who are live streaming, and a few others as well. So welcome to those of you joining us on the live stream. And welcome to Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series. I'm Rabbi Susan Shankman, and I look forward to this morning's presentation, which is sponsored by the Leo and Elizabeth Goodman Public Issues Fund. And we're thrilled to present this as our very first Amram Scholar Series session of the 2023-2024 season, which is very excited. This is our 70th season, and we will be appropriately celebrating during the course of the year. The Amram Scholar Series offers a stimulating program of free lectures throughout the year in which world-renowned speakers, authors, scholars, political leaders, policy analysts, theologians, journalists share their perspectives on timely issues or their research into history. The program traces its beginnings to the fall of 1954, when the congregation moved into its Macomb Street home. That fall, participating in a nationwide celebration that marked the 300th anniversary of Jewish settlement in the United States, Washington Hebrew launched what would become this widely recognized Sunday morning lecture program. The Amram series, as we know it today, was established a decade later in 1963 with an endowment from the estate of Adolph Amram and donations from Temple families. And today's Amram lecture is sponsored by the Leo and Elizabeth Goodman Public Issues Fund. Leo and Elizabeth Goodman were activists throughout their lives, professionally and personally. Both natives of the Boston area, they met when they served as fellow volunteer adult leaders of the Boy and Girl Scout troops, respectively, at Boston's Settlement House. Leo was an Eagle Scout. Elizabeth was pursuing her master's degree in social work at Simmons College at the time. They married the day after Elizabeth was awarded her master's degree and moved to Washington, D.C. to join Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Leo spent his career as a union lobbyist advocating for fair housing and nuclear safety, while Elizabeth spent hers developing and heading programs for children with special needs as principal of DC's Sharp Health School and visiting instruction corps, and later in the Office for Exceptional Children at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. On the personal level, they were active in civil rights. Both attended Marian Anderson's concert in 1939 at the Lincoln Memorial after she was barred from performing at the DAR Constitution Hall. They were back at the Lincoln Memorial for the 1963 March on Washington, where they heard Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. During retirement years, Leo served on WHC's Social Action Committee and was particularly active helping Iranian Jewish immigrants after the Iranian Revolution led to a takeover by religious extremists, and they had an inspirational effect on their children and grandchildren. Many of us know Lois and Joan well for their contributions, particularly through our CISA committee and Empty Nesters Inside the Issues, among other programs, and they came to this work honestly. Lois was encouraged at age 14 to join sit-ins at Glen Echo and Woolworths. Joan pursued a career as an immigration lawyer and judge. And I know that Maury, their brother, who is a 1966 WHC confirmand, is watching from Chicago, and he is a proud new, as of a couple days ago, a new grandfather. So we wish you a mazel tov, Maury. Following their deaths 38 years ago, WHC established the Leo and Elizabeth Goodman Public Issues Fund, which co-sponsors lectures and forums in their memory. And we're delighted that their family has chosen to sponsor today's lecture. And just judging from the brief conversation between our speaker and Joan Churchill prior, this is so perfectly connected. They are perfectly connected, and they have a lot to talk about well after today. So on to our speaker. David Leonhardt is a senior writer for the New York Times, where he writes The Morning, its flagship daily newsletter. How many people here subscribe to The Morning? Okay, so you already have a bunch of fans here. And if you don't yet, you can. Don't do it now, but after we're done. In October 2023, Random House published his first book, Ours is a Shining Future, The Story of the American Dream. Previously, at the Times, David was an op-ed columnist, the Washington bureau chief, a staff writer for the Sunday magazine, and the founding editor of the Upshot section. He also led a strategy group that helped Times leadership shape the newsroom's digital future. In 2011, David received the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for his columns on the economy. David has served on the boards of the American Academy of Political and Social Science and the Russell Sage Foundation, as well as on the jury of the Aspen Prize for Community College Excellence. In the fall of 2023, he is teaching at Yale University's Jackson School of Global Affairs. He majored in applied math at Yale and previously worked for Business Week magazine and the Washington Post. And David is a third-generation native of New York City who now lives here in DC. I can say that as also a third-generation New Yorker who is now living here in DC. And also I'm very proud to say that he is also an alum of the Horace Mann School, where we overlapped my senior year, his freshman year of high school, and lots to unpack there as well. But most importantly is that David comes to speak about his book, but also to bring the perspective in this time, in this moment, especially as we think of the state of the world. We're going to focus on his book to start. He's going to share about Ours Was the Shining Future. And I think this is not just a look back at history, but a look at where we are in this moment as a society, as a country, and especially as we stand poised on the precipice. I don't want to say precipice, but as we come to the outset of an election year and thinking about where we go from here as a country, having that perspective and understanding and having read it, is really not just a look back, but a look forward as well. So I'm thrilled that David Leonhardt is our opening speaker for the Amram Scholar Series, and thrilled to welcome him to Washington Hebrew Congregation.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's wonderful to be here. I feel like it's a gathering of new friends and old friends. I see so many friendly faces out in the audience, and also it's a great honor to be an Amram scholar and to be here paying tribute to the Goodman family and to Leo and Elizabeth. As Rabbi Schenkman mentioned, there's so much overlap between the things that interest me and the passions of the Goodman family over the years. As you were just introducing the series, I was making notes of all the overlap between the things that Leo and Elizabeth Goodman worked on and the things that I cover in my book. And so I hope you all recognize those similarities. They're all coincidental, which is quite wonderful. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, and then our thought was we would open it up to really spend most of our time in conversation together, and maybe start by talking about things in the book, themes related to the book. And then we'll open it up to really anything anyone wants to talk about, whether it's the election. Occasionally people have thoughts about the New York Times that they want to share. I'm happy to hear those. Really, anything at all. So one of the things that I've spent much of the last 2 weeks talking about this book publicly, and this is the first time I've given remarks about it specifically in a synagogue, and that is it's a joy for me because I can tell you a little bit more about my own family's story that I learned in the course of researching the book, not all of which is actually even in the book, because there's a level of detail about my own family that I thought not all readers needed. So my family's story in this country, or one strand of it, starts with Robert Leonhardt, who is an opera singer in Austria. He was somewhat younger than Gustav Mahler, but they were in many ways contemporaries. And as many of you may know, Gustav Mahler converted to Catholicism and largely denied his Judaism because it was impossible to make your way in the opera world of Central Europe at the time if you were Jewish. My grandfather, we don't entirely know when our family name changed, and we don't know what it used to be, but it was something much more Jewish than Leonhardt. Leonhardt is a German name that does not signify religion. We don't know whether my great-grandfather, changed it, or someone before him. But regardless, my great-grandfather, Robert Leonhardt, could not really get opera singing jobs in Austria and in Germany because he was Jewish. So he moved to the United States, and apparently the singing gene was not passed down because he was an extremely good singer, and he was hired as a baritone at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. If you Google Robert Leonhardt on Spotify when you leave here, you will still find some of my great-grandfather's recordings on Spotify. Unfortunately, despite the fact that he fled it because of anti-Semitism, he was indeed an Austrian. And so in 1918, the Metropolitan Opera fired all of its German and Austrian singers as enemy aliens. I have the New York Times clip here. Opera clears out 20 enemy aliens. And my great-grandfather was a good enough singer that the subhead is Leonhardt, baritone, and 18 of its chorus. So my grandfather was fired for being an Austrian, and he couldn't go home to his wife and 2 young children because crossing the Atlantic in the midst of World War I was quite dangerous. And he stayed in New York, and actually, tragically, he died shortly thereafter, probably of cancer, we don't know, as a very young man. His son, my grandfather, René Leonhardt, grew up fatherless in the chaos of interwar Germany, with extremely high inflation, with rising anti-Semitism. And sometime around 1930 or so, he moved to Paris, where he decided to become a journalist, which I didn't know before I started researching this book. It had been somewhat lost to family history. And René built a nice life for himself in Paris. He had a dog named Pitt. His favorite place to hang out was a cafe just off the Champs-Élysées called Le Berkeley. And he had a group of eclectic international friends from all over the place. He wore round frame eyeglasses and spoke 4 languages. But anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant feeling was rising in France in the 1930s. And shortly after the Soviet Union and Germany signed their non-aggression pact, France basically rounded up enemy aliens, many of them Jewish. There was obviously a cruel irony to this because many of the Germans and Austrians they were rounding up were Jews who had fled Germany and Austria because of the anti-Semitism. There's a clear echo with René's father's story. History has largely forgotten these camps that France opened in 1939 to put the enemy aliens in, predominantly Jews, because they were not concentration camps. France did not kill the people in them. But they were really horrible places. So many people were rounded up in Paris that they had to use 2 large sports stadiums, Stade Olympique Yves du Manoir, which had hosted the World Cup the year before, and Roland Garros, which I'm sure many of you know as the host of the tennis tournament that has since become known as the French Open. The men were told to bring blankets, underwear, eating utensils, and 2 days' worth of food. Once they got to the camps, it became clear that they would be there much longer than 2 days. The writer Arthur Koestler, who is also one of the prisoners, described the conditions there as torture through deprivation. Most tragically, many members of these camps were still in them when the Nazis invaded France and took over, and for them it was a death sentence. But criticism of France's establishment of these camps was rising both within France and around the world. American publications said that it would be easier for France to claim the mantle of democracy if it weren't locking up its own Jewish citizens. And so France began to release some of the members of the camps, particularly if they had visas to leave France and thus could not operate as German spies in France. And yes, it is a ludicrous notion that the German Jews of France would be operating as German spies, but that was the fear at the time. My grandfather, René, was lucky enough to be one of the people who had a visa to leave. He'd gotten it while anti-immigrant feeling was rising in France. And he got a ticket on a boat to New York, and he arrived here on February 26th, 1940, and he was detained for 3 days and released into New York on February 29th, 1940. It's not totally clear how he got permanent immigration status in the United States. It looks like he got a couple of extensions on his visa, but it certainly helped that he soon met a young woman named Esther Messing, who worked as a secretary at a newspaper in Times Square, and they fell madly in love. So madly in love that they did not wait for the usual waiting period for a marriage license. They traveled down to a town in Virginia that was the Las Vegas of its day, where there was no need to wait for a marriage license, and Esther and René got married there. Esther, of course, is my grandmother. And they couldn't have known it at the time, but Esther and René were starting a family in New York in 1940 in a society that had one of the brightest futures that the world has ever known. The United States was starting to emerge from the Depression. 9 years before, a historian named James Truslow Adams had written a book in which he coined a new term, the American dream. He defined the American dream as that dream of a better, richer, and happier life for all our citizens of every rank, which is the greatest contribution we have as yet made to the thought and welfare of the world. I love that definition. There's so much in it. It embeds the notion of progress, right? He says better, richer, happier life. It embeds the notion of social mobility. He says it's for all our citizens of every rank. And it includes the idea that the United States is different from the rest of the world in this way. It says it is the greatest contribution we have as yet made to the thought and welfare of the world. It was a remarkably optimistic book to write in 1931 in the midst of the Great Depression. And he ended it in a remarkably optimistic way. He quoted a writer named Mary Anton, who was a Jewish immigrant from Russia, who arrived here knowing no English. And he quoted from her book, where she is sitting on the steps of the Boston Public Library, a city that Leo and Elizabeth Goodman knew well. And she looks up and she says, "Mine is the shining future." That obviously is a phrase that we stole for my title, but we changed it to "Ours was the shining future" to reflect both the group notion of it, not just mine, but ours, and to reflect the idea that Americans used to be optimistic, more optimistic than they are now. In the decades to come, the audaciously optimistic vision of James Trussell Adams and Mary Anton and so many other Americans came true. Life expectancy rose for the vast majority of Americans. It rose even though inequality and discrimination and all kinds of injustices remained in American society. 92% of Americans who were born in 1940, the year Rene arrived in this country, the year he and Esther met, 92% of Americans grew up to earn more money than their parents did. It was a virtual guarantee. It was true of people who suffered a layoff. It was true of many people who were not WASP men. 92% of Americans were not WASP men in 1940. And it created this deeply optimistic society, because when progress is the norm, it feeds on itself. People are able to be proud of the progress that they and their family and their community have made. They can have faith in their country and in the institutions that surround them, whether those institutions are schools or companies or neighborhoods or churches or synagogues or mosques or labor unions or government agencies. People can trust that their own sacrifices will pay off, not every time, but often enough. They can endure hard times without becoming cynical, and they can be generous toward others. They can look to the future with a can-do optimism. If I'm ever tempted to feel frustrated by any aspect of my life, or my relatives are, we can remind ourselves how much better we are off than Robert or Rene Leonhardt. This optimism has long been a distinctly American trait, and no wonder. This nation was born by casting off the world's most powerful empire. We later defeated fascism. We sent a man to the moon. We created the internet, and we created the largest, most prosperous middle class that the world has ever known. American optimism was rational. Progress begot progress until it didn't. Today, of course, we are not an optimistic nation. People often use the phrase American dream bitterly or ironically. People are frustrated and they are angry. And while I decry the forms that this frustration often takes, political polarization, angry rhetoric, fear of others, even support for authoritarianism, I do think that the frustration is in many ways understandable. I do think Americans have reason to be frustrated and angry about the course our society has taken. I began today by telling you an ultimately inspiring story about my family. It includes tragedy. Rene Leonhardt also died young. He died at age 45, I believe. My dad barely knew him. But obviously, Robert and Rene created a much better life for our family in this country that allowed us to enjoy things that they never could. I know many of you can tell similar stories in this room. Some of you can tell much more impressive, inspiring stories than my family's. Those stories are the kinds of stories that breed optimism and breed hope and make people willing to deal with hard times without becoming cynical. And many Americans can't tell stories about their own families and their own communities that are inspiring today, because instead their lives have stagnated. For almost a half century now, incomes and wealth have grown at a sluggish pace for most Americans, even as they have surged for the wealthy. Incomes have grown more slowly for the vast majority of Americans than the economy has grown. Measures of public health have also stagnated, and the problems seem to have worsened in the past decade. I think this is the biggest indictment of the course that our society has taken recently. In 1980, the United States had a typical life expectancy for a rich country, fairly similar to much of Western Europe. Today, the United States has the lowest life expectancy in the world of any rich country, lower than every country in Western Europe, lower than Japan, lower than South Korea, lower than Canada, than Australia. Our life expectancy is even lower than some countries that are not that wealthy, like Chile and Slovenia and China. For working class people, life expectancy began to stagnate even before the COVID pandemic, and life expectancy is not supposed to stagnate in an advanced society, absent a crisis like a war or a plague. The main reason for this stagnation for so many Americans is a class divide. Life expectancy has not stagnated for people with a 4-year college degree. My book is a story of a rise and a fall of an economy that produced mass prosperity. And so I want to spend a few minutes on the rise, because I actually think it's more relevant to what we need to do to get back to an economy that makes people optimistic about the future. I mentioned that Americans born in 1940 have a 92% chance of out-earning their parents. It's a remarkable statistic. And I want to focus for a second on how that happened by telling you a story of a different family, not my family, but the Randolph family, who lived in Jacksonville, Florida, early in the 20th century and had 2 boys. The parents didn't have a lot of education, but they were committed to the idea of their boys having more education. The Randolph mother operated a very small sewing business in their house and kept a garden that sold food to neighbors. The Randolph father was an AME preacher, but not at the big fancy AME or somewhat fancy AME churches in Jacksonville, in the much poorer churches in the surrounding rural areas. And they insisted that their 2 boys read all the time, often on the porch of their modest house, reading not only the Bible, but reading Jane Austen and Charles Darwin and Charles Dickens and African history and American history. And one of their sons, named Asa, decided that he did not want to live his life in the segregation of Jacksonville. So he moved to New York, and he took night classes at City College, and he became a soapbox orator in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. And he was very good at it. He gave speeches that people noticed. He also began writing, mostly for leftist publications. One of these publications described itself as a journal of scientific socialism. The FBI described this same publication as by far the most dangerous of the Negro publications today. Because Asa became a writer, he thought, Asa Randolph is not quite an Augusta name for a writer. I need a fancier byline. So he decided to use a different version of his full name, a name many of you have probably heard, A. Philip Randolph. And A. Philip Randolph, as part of his soapbox oration, got noticed by a local group that was trying to organize the first labor union for Black Americans in this country. They were trying to organize railroad porters, who were overwhelmingly male, and railroad maids for the Pullman Company, who were overwhelmingly female. They were almost all Black. They wanted to become the country's first meaningful union for Black workers. And at the organization meeting of this union at the Elks Lodge in Harlem in 1925, A. Philip Randolph said, "The history of all groups in America and everywhere else who are at the bottom of the economic ladder is that they raise themselves up and are able to provide themselves a viable life only through organization." A. Philip Randolph believed that a better life would happen through political organization. And I want to pause here for 1 second to reflect on just what a phenomenal underdog effort this was, just how unlikely it was to succeed. In 1925, labor unions lost every battle they tried to fight. Companies were able to prevent them from organizing again and again and again. Labor unions were just shrinking and weak. And they weren't only trying to start a labor union, they were trying to start a labor union for Black workers. And going up against a company called the Pullman Company that was one of the most prestigious companies companies in America. You can almost think of it like compared to a private jet company today. J.P. Morgan was on the board of the Pullman Company. Members of the Whitney family had been on the board. Sloan had been on the board of the Pullman Company. And yet A. Philip Randolph and his colleagues decided they were going to organize these black workers to try to get them more than poverty level wages. And they failed and failed and failed, and then they ultimately succeeded. They failed because the company refused to recognize them and tried to fire the people who were organizing workers. They failed because workers were afraid of joining a labor union in the midst of the Great Depression. At one point, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the union, had so little money that they were evicted from their Harlem office and their furniture was moved out into the street. But then eventually they succeeded because they had persuaded thousands of workers to join this union, and crucially, because there was an administration in Washington that decided to change the law to make it possible for people to join labor unions. The Roosevelt administration and its labor secretary, Francis Perkins. Within weeks of a Supreme Court decision that made it impossible for the Pullman Company to continue ignoring the union, the company finally agreed to negotiate with it. The maids got a 30% raise, the porters got a 15% raise, and they all got a 30% reduction in hours. And I would ask you to reflect on how many hours they must have been working if they got a 30% reduction in hours, because they were not part-time workers when that settlement was done. That settlement made A. Philip Randolph the most famous man in Black America, most famous person in Black America, almost certainly. And he realized he could use this union to continue to push for political change. It had Pullman porters all over the country. They traveled the country, they read newspapers. And so he decided that he was going to turn this union into the beginning of a civil rights movement. And he and his deputy decided to organize a march. And he said they were going to bring 10,000 Black Americans to Washington, and A. Philip Randolph, in 1941, this march, and A. Philip Randolph coined a term for this march. He said, we're going to call it the March on Washington. And they ultimately had so much success and interest that they upped their goal from 10,000 people coming to Washington to 100,000 people coming to Washington to march for two things in 1941, the integration of the military and the integration of the factories that everyone understood were going to build the arsenal, at the time people thought mostly for England, but if the United States entered the war, for the United States as well. FDR, who had been Randolph's ally in creating labor unions, absolutely hated this idea. The notion that tens of thousands of Black Americans would be marching in Washington in 1941 and calling the world's attention to the great injustice of the United States, racism and segregation, Roosevelt understood would undercut the United States' image as a friend of democracy around the world, just as those camps in France had undercut France's image as an ally of democracy. And so the Roosevelt administration tried everything it possibly could think of to get the March on Washington canceled. They sent their emissary to the civil rights movement, the person who was most friendly with these early civil rights organizers, Eleanor Roosevelt, to reach out to A. Philip Randolph and plead with him to cancel the march. She said, it will be dangerous to your marchers. Do you understand how racist the Washington Police Department is? It will be horrible. Where will these marchers sleep? And A. Philip Randolph said no. He said, we're not canceling the march. If we cancel the march, you'll never integrate the military or wartime factories. So the Roosevelt administration then took the next step, which is they invited A. Philip Randolph and a couple other march organizers to the Oval Office to meet with the President of the United States so FDR could try to persuade him to cancel the march. You may remember a minute ago I told you that A. Philip Randolph had taken night classes at City College. He didn't graduate from City College. He didn't have a college degree. He was, however, a remarkably gifted public speaker. He also dressed extremely well. And so, somehow, FDR got confused about A. Philip Randolph's background, and when he entered the Oval Office, the first thing that the President of the United States said to A. Philip Randolph was, "Hello, Phil, what class were you at Harvard?" Roosevelt, of course, was the class of 1904. Randolph replied, "I never went to Harvard, Mr. President." And FDR said, "I was sure you did. Anyway, you and I share a kinship in our great interest in human and social justice." Randolph replied, "That's right, Mr. President." The meeting got worse from there. FDR told Randolph to cancel the march. Randolph said no. FDR became frustrated, and Randolph still said no. Again, I'll ask you to reflect on what a remarkable moment of history this is. A. Philip Randolph, a black man in the United States in 1941, is being ordered to do something by the President of the United States, who has just been elected for the third time, and he says no. The aides then try to figure out what to do after the meeting ends, and what they do is they fold. They reach out to A. Philip Randolph and they say, we are going to issue an executive order integrating wartime factories. At this point, Randolph has stopped focusing on integrating the military. He understands that the factories are a more achievable goal because integrating the military could be seen to be interfering with US wartime preparations. But Roosevelt integrates factories. And the question is, how is it that A. Philip Randolph was able to achieve this remarkable victory and face down the President of the United States? And I think the answer is clearly that he had built political power. The term that Randolph liked to use was mass power. And I think that is the single most important explanation for how we built an economy that had mass prosperity in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's not the only thing going on. The United States had remarkable advantages during these decades that we're never going to recover. The rest of the world was so weak. It was either bombed out because of World War II, or the Southern Hemisphere was emerging from colonialism. Russia and China were dealing with communism, an economic system that doesn't really work. And so the United States had advantages that other countries didn't. But the reason we built not just a strong economy, but an economy in which the benefits were shared widely, was in large part because of political power. It was in large part because of labor unions like A. Philip Randolph's, and it was in large part because of other labor unions like the United Auto Workers. It was also because these grassroots movements elected governments that protected the interests of the masses of Americans. The Democratic Party won 5 straight terms in the White House during these decades, and the Republican Party largely accepted an economy where we had both high wages and high profits. When Dwight Eisenhower, who is the candidate of corporate America, was elected president in 1952, the first Republican to hold the job since Hoover, he did not try to reduce the top marginal tax rate, which was then 90%, which is a sign of how different things had been at the time. In my book, I cite 3 main forces that built mass prosperity in the middle of the 20th century: political power, culture, particularly a corporate culture that was more patriotic and less selfish, and investment in the future. No president did more to invest in the future than Dwight Eisenhower. He famously built the interstate highway system. He increased federal spending on research and development more than any other president, Republican or Democratic. Education expanded in this country. You put these 3 things together: power, culture, and investment. And I would argue that we had a system that fairly can be described as democratic capitalism. That's democratic with a small d, not the Democratic Party. Democratic capitalism, which some other people call moral capitalism or managed capitalism, describes a system in which the government recognizes its crucial role in guiding the economy. The free market does many, many things well. I've already told you, communism doesn't work. But the free market also has a set of excesses that it lapses into. Inequality tends to rise when the government doesn't manage capitalism. We end up with problems like the tragedy of the commons, including climate change. I like the term democratic capitalism because it acknowledges that capitalism works best when the government has a role. It acknowledges that democracy strengthens capitalism and capitalism strengthens democracy. And I would argue that democratic capitalism has a clearly superior record to free market capitalism. The democratic capitalism that emerged in the 1930s led to much larger gains in living standards for most Americans than the previous decades. And I've already mentioned what has happened in this country since the 1980s. So let's turn to that for a minute. How then did we move away from democratic capitalism as a society? I think that both the political and left and the political right play a role here, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Starting in the 1960s, the political left in this country increasingly came to reflect and to embody the views of relatively affluent professionals and college graduates, rather than working class people like A. Philip Randolph, who had made up the party's base in the 1950s and 60s. To put this in local terms, the Democratic Party has become more Bethesda and less Baltimore. And I live in Bethesda, so if you're offended by that. It's true nationwide. Thomas Piketty, the economist, has used the phrase the Brahmin left to describe the upscaling of both the American left and the European left. One of the things that I was most fascinated to learn while researching and writing this book is how many of the political trends that we're grappling with today on the left have their roots in the 1960s. The Democratic Party really started to become a more upscale version of liberalism, a less working class version of liberalism in the 1960s. In the early 1960s, many voters were concerned about rising crime, and many liberals dismissed these worries as a conservative fantasy. The liberals were wrong. Crime really was rising in the 1960s. I read pieces in The Nation and The New Republic that put crime increase in quotes, as if it wasn't really happening. But it was happening. You can go back and look at any time series and see it was happening. People on the left also became critical not only of the government's conduct of the war in Vietnam, which was certainly fair criticism, but also of the soldiers fighting in it. This criticism was particularly offensive to many working class Americans because of many well-off Americans were not fighting in Vietnam. They were avoiding it because of student deferments. People on the left became critical of America of itself. They were less willing to embrace patriotic symbols like the flag. And that was a big departure for the left. The movements on the political left in this country in the 30s and 40s embraced the flag. Unions flew the flag. The Democratic Party in the 1960s also enacted an immigration policy that senior members of the party, LBJ, Ted Kennedy, and others, repeatedly promised would not lead to an increase in immigration. They said, we are changing our immigration system to make it fairer and less racist, which they were, and which was a phenomenal accomplishment. They allowed immigration to be a first-come, first-served basis rather than basically just being from Western Europe. They opened it up to Southern Europe and Eastern Europe and Africa and Asia. But they promised we are not changing the number of immigrants who come here. One of the things that my book does is go through these quotes in details. They were promised it repeatedly. Ted Kennedy said, anyone who suggests otherwise, who suggests that this bill will lead to an increase in immigration, is engaging in unfair criticism that does not deserve to be part of the political dialogue. The Democrats who made those promises were wrong about them. They were badly, badly wrong. Within a couple of years, immigration started to rise. It has soared. The percentage of this country that is foreign-born is now back to the peak that it was. In sheer numbers, it's probably the largest increase in immigration in recorded human history. We can talk about the great benefits of that surge in immigration. We can talk about some of the downsides. But I think it's important to remember it was sold to the American people with false pretenses. For all these reasons, many working-class Americans became alienated from the Democratic Party. They have more moderate and even conservative views on social issues, whether it's crime, national security, immigration, and patriotism. Obviously, race and racism are part of this story. The Democratic Party was going to lose huge numbers of working-class people because of its embrace of civil rights in the 1960s. But I think it's important to say this is not only about race, and Democrats do a disservice to themselves and to the country when they claim it is only about race. Another figure in my book is Robert F. Kennedy, who is rightly remembered as a progressive hero, who was the most popular white politician in Black America during his 1968 campaign for president. I trace RFK's 68 campaign because it was remarkably conservative and moderate on many issues that weren't about economics and weren't about race. RFK respected the more moderate views of working class Americans on a long list of issues. He didn't look down on them. He didn't say you're ignorant or you're hateful if you aren't as liberal on social issues as I am. This move toward the Brahmin left, which obviously has major echoes in today's politics, created an opening for the Republican Party in the 1970s to make a case to working class voters whom it had lost. For decades, the Republican Party had tried to do so through economics, saying the big government of these decades fails, and this message did not resonate at all. Milton Friedman wrote one of his most important books, Capitalism and Freedom, in 1962. It was almost totally ignored. Milton Friedman kept a list of the many publications that did not even review his book. You'll be shocked to hear the New York Times was on the list of publications that did not review his book. For the new right during these decades, economics was the weakest part of their case. They had much more success attracting voters by talking about the evils of pornography or of drugs or of pointing out the hypocrisy of school busing that included cities where working class people lived, but not suburbs where more affluent people lived. But then the 1970s oil crisis created an opening for the Republican Party to attract working class voters on the basis of economics. And Milton Friedman and Robert Bork, who is a character in my book, and Ronald Reagan were able to make their case that a different kind of economy, one with low taxes, particularly for rich people, less regulation, relatively few unions, widespread trade, widespread immigration, and antitrust laws that allowed companies to grow very large. They said all these things will make our country prosperous for everyone. They made repeated promises. This will make our country more prosperous for everyone. I think the record has proved them wrong. I do not think the United States has become more prosperous than it was since 1980. I already mentioned the life expectancy statistic to you. We were a normal country for life expectancy in 1980. We're now the worst that there is. It's not just life expectancy. Incomes and wealth have stagnated. Polls show that Americans are angry about the country's direction, and they tend to be whether a Republican or Democrat is president. All kinds of other indicators of social health have deteriorated. Many more Americans spend time behind bars today than used to be the case. Many more Americans grow up in families without two parents. Chronic pain has risen. Drug abuse has risen. This is where I think we have ended up, and I think it explains why Americans are so frustrated. Despite all this, or maybe just because I am a constitutionally optimistic person, I do think there are reasons for optimism today. I even think there are reasons for optimism to be found in the stories that I've just told you. I think the same set of forces that created mass prosperity in the 20th century and have dismantled mass prosperity over the last few decades can again create mass prosperity. And I would ask you, how did A. Philip Randolph change the economy? How did Milton Friedman and the New Right then change the economy again? They did so using the tools of American democracy. They started movements. Intellectuals made arguments that meant to win people over. Grassroots organizers started organizations that people joined, like the New Right organizations in the 1960s, like the labor unions in the 1930s and 40s. These movements set out to change public opinion. They set out to elect friendly politicians, and ultimately they changed laws that transformed our economy. I think that the tools that have created this economy that doesn't work for so many Americans can also be used again to create an economy that does work for so many Americans. And I don't think that's just theoretical optimism. I think if you look around and look at the grassroots organizations that we've actually had in this country that have succeeded, they have used these same tools. Marriage equality became the law of the land much more rapidly than I think almost anyone would have predicted a couple decades ago. It did so by making a case about human equality. It also did so by acknowledging that many Americans are moderate to conservative on social issues. How did the marriage equality movement succeed? By holding up the ideal of marriage. And how did the gay rights movement succeed? By talking about the importance of serving in the military. They both made arguments that appealed to Americans who are not as far left on all kinds of social issues. It's not just the marriage equality movement. The disability rights movement of the 1970s, which Elizabeth Goodman played a role in, succeeded by persuading Americans and electing friendly politicians and changing the law. It's how the civil rights movement changed this country. It's how the women's rights movement changed this country. It's also how movements on the political right have changed this country. I know many people today are tempted to look at the political system and give up on it as hopelessly rigged. But I would remind you, whatever your views on abortion, look at what the anti-abortion movement did after suffering their worst defeat, Roe v. Wade in 1973. It didn't give up on the political system as hopelessly rigged. It organized, it started groups, it took over the Republican Party, it figured out ways to win elections and get friendly judges appointed, and it basically launched a 50-year campaign to change the laws in this country. Grassroots movements, the kind of movements that create what A. Philip Randolph called mass power, still can succeed in the United States. I think our biggest problem is not that we have had mass movements devoted to creating widespread prosperity that have failed in recent years. I think the biggest problem is we have not had mass movements devoted to creating widespread prosperity in this country. They have been focused elsewhere. The Republican Party has continued to follow policies that I think are harmful to many Americans, and the Democratic Party has become less focused on working class Americans. And a massive divide has opened in the meantime. If you want one more reason for optimism about what political movements can do to change our economy, I do actually think there are two exceptions. Two political movements that did try to improve life for most Americans and succeeded. The grassroots movement to prevent Donald Trump from repealing Obamacare didn't seem like it was going to work. He had the votes to repeal Obamacare. And then there was this huge movement that showed up at meetings and lobbied politicians, and by a single vote prevented him from repealing Obamacare. Millions of Americans have health insurance today because of that movement. And the second one is the Fight for 15, which is the campaign to try to raise the minimum wage in many parts of the country. I've mentioned to you how conservative many Americans, or at least moderate, are on social and cultural issues. They're also pretty progressive on economic issues. And increases in the minimum wage and expansions of Medicare have passed in both blue and red states alike. If we had a set of movements that were geared toward increasing wages not just for minimum wage workers, but for people who make above the minimum wage, if we had movements that were devoted to improving education, not just for children who are as unfortunate as mine, but most children in America, if we had movements that were devoted to making it possible for people like Starbucks workers to join a labor union, or for people to get more affordable health care, I really think these movements could succeed. As much as I worry about the condition of our country and our economy today, I still think we have the tools to fix our problems, and I think the only plausible path we can take is to try to fix our problems. Thank you all so much for listening to me today. I look forward to your questions and disagreements and anything else you want.
I'm going to start off with one, maybe two questions, but knowing this crowd, I'm probably going to just do one because I know I see some of the hands already twitching. Certainly, first of all, thank you. If you have not yet read the book, I encourage you to. It is available once we're done here. You can have an opportunity to buy it and also to have it signed and to continue the conversation. So, David, you talk in the book about three main areas. You talk about power, culture, and investment. And you speak as well, and you spoke this morning too, about this political realignment that happened in order to get to that place where we were moving towards that American dream. And with your optimism, how does that, especially as we're going into an election year, what do you think needs to happen? It's possible. We talk about unions, we talk about grassroots movements, which often carry also some type of political overlay to them. So given power, culture, investment, what would be an ideal situation in which, and what needs to happen in the next year in order for us to move to that place?
I do think we're seeing some reconsideration on both the right and the left of the economic policies we've had over the last 40 or 50 years. I think it was reasonable for people in the 1970s to say, maybe we should try this kind of laissez-faire economy. Maybe it would work better. Because the economy was really terrible in the 1970s. Now, much of that was just because of oil prices, right? I mean, the echo with today is pretty remarkable, right? The 50-year anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, which obviously is connected to the October 7th attacks. The Yom Kippur War is what led to the 1973 Arab embargo, which really is a hinge point for the American economy. And the economy of the 70s was so weak in part because of high oil prices. But government policy had also played a role. LBJ had helped spark inflation as well. It wasn't as important as the oil prices by spending money on Vietnam and spending money on social programs at the same time. So I think it was reasonable for people to say, let's try a totally different kind of economy. It just hasn't worked by almost any measure. And so I take some comfort in the fact that on both the right and the left, you do see some reflection of this. So there's a group called American Compass, which is a Republican group that's trying to rethink this focus on kind of Reaganism, free market economics. And they talk about, hey, you know what? Having really big, powerful companies isn't actually consistent with conservative values. And having labor unions where people come together in their community, that actually is consistent with conservative values. And some of this is now just Republicans signing statements, which maybe we shouldn't put that much stock in. But some of it is their votes. You know, Biden's investments in infrastructure and semiconductors, which have an echo of the Eisenhower investments, got some Republican votes. And then similarly on the Democratic Party, I think we also see more reflection on some of these issues. I don't think we yet see enough reflection from either party, but I think there's a reason why people are more skeptical about things like trade than they used to be. And there's a reason why you see Joe Biden saying that unions are really important. I mean, to be self-reflective, I've been writing about the economy for 20 years. And I just, as part of working on this book, I came to realize I have not paid enough attention to the importance of labor unions. They're just vital for workers to be on the same footing as negotiating with companies or close to it. I've been in a union. I'm a manager at the New York Times who manages unions. I know they've got problems. They're deeply flawed. But the other thing that's deeply flawed are corporations. And if you have flawed corporations without any check on them, you end up with the economy that we have today, which is extremely high inequality.
So before I go to, I see the hands coming up. We talked a little bit a few days ago about this idea of unions, having connections with unions, and how many people here have had family members going back in history who were connected to labor unions at some point in, yeah. So and thinking about that at one point certainly that was a natural or sort of a given, especially in many of, when we think about Jewish history in this country and who was at the forefront of some of those labor unions. How do we think about the importance of unions? I've heard there were a lot of things on Facebook. I saw a lot of people posting about Starbucks and the union, and that's something that impacts people every day who might not otherwise be engaged or thinking about unions, right? So for many of us, it doesn't impact us in the same way it did maybe a generation ago or 2 generations ago, but it does impact us. We just might not be aware of it in our everyday lives. Yeah. What is something that we can do to really move the needle on that in a way that has that positive impact that we know, because I'll stop there.
So I would say a couple things. I do think it's important that unions reflect on their own failures. And I think one of the most interesting things about the UAW leadership, the new UAW leadership, is they basically reflected on the fact, and the way they won the election within the UAW is that they properly criticized the current union leadership as self-interested and at times corrupt, and said, hey, we're going to come in there and we're going to fight for you, not fight for ourselves. And so I think it's important that unions be reflective about their own failures. One of my deep frustrations with my own union is I felt like the union representatives were basically there looking out for themselves more than they were looking out for me and my family. I think in the long term, it's going to require a change in the law. Starbucks has almost totally succeeded in preventing unions from organizing, even at stores where most workers say they want to join unions. They've done the same thing that the Pullman Company did to A. Philip Randolph, which is they assign the people who are trying to organize unions to a late night shift one day and an early morning shift the next day. They spread negative stories about the people trying to organize the unions. They find other people to spread those stories. A. Philip Randolph was bitterly criticized in the black press and by black preachers who said, why are you potentially upsetting what we've got at the Pullman Company? He was called a Bolshevik hustler and wormy Pullman fruit. And so companies like Starbucks can prevent their workers from joining unions by coming up with reasons to fire those who try to form them. That will require a change in the law. And Democrats keep saying they're in favor of changing the law to make that happen, but they keep somehow not making it the priority when they take office. They pass the bills on healthcare and on climate change and on infrastructure, and somehow they don't get around to passing the bills that make it possible for low-wage workers to join unions.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to try to do this. I will hope to get to everyone. Just stay patient. I see the hands.
Mine's a quickie. You've mentioned Mr. Randolph over and over again as a real shining star, someone who was an engine in making change. Do you see anybody in 2023 who may be that voice, who may be that energy?
That's a fair question. Look, I don't see a specific individual who is, but if we were sitting here in 1927, we wouldn't have known A. Philip Randolph's name either, right? And so, I do think there are many people who are committed to making change. During one of my book talks, I was asked, it was a gathering of many people who had children in high school or college. And I was basically asked, what would you say to members of a younger generation that you'd want them to take away from this? And what I would say to members of a younger generation, if you are as privileged as many of our children and grandchildren are, one, reflect on the fact that many Americans have not been so privileged, that there is this fundamental divide. I know people often talk about the 1% and the 99%, and in some ways that's a useful divide, but I would instead say let's look at the divide between people who have four-year college degrees and the majority of Americans who still don't have four-year college degrees, and think about just how much harder life is for those people than it is for people with college degrees. And then I know how progressive many young people are today. I would also ask them to think about how is it possible to create a social justice movement that actually speaks for and speaks to and includes people who are less privileged than many of today's social justice movements, and that are more inclusive of people who don't come from as privileged a background, and doesn't alienate the same people for whom these movements claim to speak. And I think that is one of the most important things, and that's part of why I keep mentioning labor unions, because they almost by definition are movements that can exist across economic groups, rather than being more elite movements that talk down to people. And to me, the most inspiring things are people who try to break out of our divides and try to unite people across groups.
I have two slightly prosaic questions regarding the beginning of your talk. The first question I have regarding the American dream. Do you think that the American dream still is alive with the 2 million migrants that have crossed into the country since 2023? That's number one. And then the second one is, with respect to A. Philip Randolph's meeting with President Roosevelt, was Roosevelt amenable to making the change? Was he already predisposed to supporting? He was not. He was not. He was against.
So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. So there's a somewhat, actually someone's asked about it me during my book tour. There's a somewhat apocryphal version of the story that I found no evidence for, where Roosevelt says, help me do what I already want to do. I think Roosevelt was open to the idea of integrating wartime factories, but I really think he wanted to push it down the road. I mean, Roosevelt in 1941 did not spend a lot of time thinking about how to push a civil rights agenda in this country. It just was not important to him. What was important to him was keeping together his coalition that included a lot of Southern Democrats. And part of what's fascinating is those Southern Democrats, they were legitimate populists. Many Southern politicians today are fake populists. They use sort of populist rhetoric, but then they pass policies that go in the other direction. These were legitimate populists. It's just their version of populism was segregated populism. It was just for white people. And I think Roosevelt was really much more focused on keeping that coalition together than he was on integrating the wartime factories.
But isn't it a wonderful economic solution if the men are at war, the factories need labor, and you have a labor force you can slide into place?
Yes. So.
Isn't that a really
But that wasn't persuasive to Roosevelt, right? He wasn't in favor of doing it for that reason. Actually, that's a very interesting thing. But let me answer your second question. You mean, so I do actually think the American dream still has enormous power, and particularly for people who come from around the world. And I think it's important to say that immigrants who have come here in the last several decades have done remarkably well. My favorite set of scholarship on this, because it's the most extensive, is a book called Streets of Gold by two economists, in which they use decades of tax records and census records to trace the paths of recent immigrants and compare them to the paths of immigrants like my family, who came here in the late 19th and early 20th century. And you often hear, particularly from opponents of immigration, you often hear the idea that immigrants today don't do as well as those past immigrants do. That's wrong. With all the evidence that we have, we can't really know about immigrants who come here in the last decade or so, but of all evidence we have, recent immigrants from Latin America and Asia are following a remarkable similar trajectory in terms of income, in terms of intermarriage, in terms of learning English, in terms of all kinds of things as the immigrants from the 19th and 20th century. So I really do think there are many ways in which the American dream is alive.
So I have 2 points. The first point is you mentioned the majority of Americans, or close to majority of Americans, support more of a populist agenda. So a socially more moderate, conservative, and then economically more progressive, pro-union, pro-labor. And like you mentioned, how neither the GOP or the Democratic Party really represent that. And then this figure comes in, aka Trump comes in. It kind of does represent that, and he actually calls out a lot of the things that you said went wrong in trying to change that, and then he was, viciously shouted down by the establishment. And I guess I'm interested. Why do you think there's a huge disconnect there? Like, why is it wrong for the average person in Ohio who's experiencing, industrialization, globalization, the drugs, pharmaceuticals come in, and colleges have gone up by 300%, housing, the economy doesn't work for them, so why is it wrong to vote for Donald Trump?
Yeah. So I would say a couple things. Before I get to Trump, first of all, I just want to describe what is my favorite chart about American politics. It's not in the book because it's too recent, and one of the experiences I had, I read all or parts of 100 books while writing this book and I kept having this experience, is I'd be reading a book that was maybe written in 1970, and I'd be reading the parts about the 19-teens and the 1920s, and I'd be saying, this book is so amazing, it's so great. And then I get to the parts about the 1960s, and I would think, this book's a little off. I think it's incredibly difficult to make judgments about your own time, which is why much of my book stops around the turn of the 21st century. But this chart is amazing, in which they ask Americans a big battery of poll questions, some economic, some social, and then they put everyone on a two-dimensional chart, right? A typical graph we've seen. Every respondent is a dot. And one of the axes is economic views, left, right, and one of the axes is social or cultural views, left, right, although you have to do it up, down, if that makes sense. So you can imagine a chart now with 4 quadrants. Does that sound right? People who are to the left on both things are in one quadrant, and there are a lot of Americans who are to the left of both things. People who are to the right on both things are in the catty corner quadrant. A lot of Americans are like that. These are committed Democrats and committed Republicans. Then there's a quadrant that is economically moderate or conservative and socially liberal, right? I'm guessing we all know a fair number of people who describe themselves that way, right? That is the most empty quadrant in American politics, right? The final quadrant, which is economically more left and socially more right, is nearly as crowded as the quadrants that are right, right, and left, left. That is also, those are the swing voters in American politics, right? Those voters. Many of them are loyal to one or the other, but many of them also swing. And so I think it's important to remember that this really is where the contest for American politics is fought. I agree with you. Donald Trump tried to appeal to those voters. In a way that is sometimes hard to understand, Donald Trump really did run to the left of the Republican Party on a whole bunch of economic issues. He said, unlike Paul Ryan, I'm not going to cut Medicare and Social Security. He said, I think trade has been bad, right, in all kinds of ways. But I think the two things that are important to then say about Trump are, he also really ran with pretty horrible race-baiting rhetoric. I mean, the things that he said about large groups of Americans were really deeply offensive. And that does not have to be part of this sort of economic populism and social moderation, right? Being in favor of border security does not have to involve racism. Being in favor of reopening the economy during COVID does not have to involve racism. Embracing the American flag does not have to involve racism. But Donald Trump brought that all together. And then the second thing I would say is he didn't really govern that way, right? Donald Trump didn't really do that much to improve the economic lot of most people. He instead cut taxes for affluent people. And so he was much more of a rhetorical populist than an actual populist. But if your question is there good reason why someone in Ohio might have been attracted to that mix? Yes, absolutely. And so, yeah, and I guess what I would say is compare his record to his words. That's what I would ask of, when Joe Biden went to talk at a union factory in Detroit to support the workers, Donald Trump went to talk at a non-union factory. But I appreciate the question.
Can you discuss the impact of the deregulation of the financial industry and the growth of private equity?
So I think it's been...
Before, Dave, I just want people to know, I see the hands. I know some of you are getting impatient. I'm trying to get to everyone.
I'll make my
Please be
answer shorter
patient.
so we get to more questions.
No,
so
please don't.
I think that I think that's been a big part of the kind of growth of large companies and the growth of inequality. I think part of what we've seen is a huge shift of income toward the financial sector. We've also seen many of the students, college graduates who can go work anywhere, choose to go work in those sectors. I think finance is a vital part of a capitalist economy, channeling money to productive investments. I think the question is, have we ended up with one where finance is much bigger than we need for our productive economy, and is it actually good for us? And I think the answer is we have ended up with that economy.
One of the arguments for wage increases is that there have been tremendous gains in labor productivity over whatever relevant period. But if most of those gains are due to greater invested capital per worker, then does that argument work as an argument for increasing labor share of productivity gains? Or do you have to revert to other kinds of arguments about fairness and about social cohesion and so forth, but not an economic argument about who's responsible for the productivity gains?
I think the problem is when you track productivity gains and compare them to wages, wages have trailed productivity gains, right? And so to me, that we shouldn't have confidence that as if only we have an economy that is highly productive, that most workers will be able to share in that productivity and will get the fruits from it. And I think the last 50 years argues for having some skepticism that there is kind of a natural, non-political economic mechanism by which, as long as we're becoming more productive, people are going to get wage increases. I think we need both. I think we need investments in the future that make us more productive. And then I also think we need political systems and economic rules that make sure that the gains from that productivity don't go to a narrow slice of people. And so to me, it's both a question of growing the pie and making sure the pie is divided in some way that's fair.
I thought your comments about Eisenhower were incredibly interesting. Can you suggest why historically he seems to be lost or not, or infrequently mentioned among great presidents, or any commentary at all about his presidency?
Yeah. He was old when he was president, or at least what we used to think of was as old for a president. By the time he left, he was kind of seen as this square figure of the 1950s who was being replaced by the glamorous JFK. But I think he was really important. I mean, one, he did kind of codify many of the New Deal changes that had created this mass prosperity. And two, he understood that he was a fiscal conservative. He cut spending relative to what Truman and FDR did. But I think he understood that whether you're a fiscal conservative who believes in a smaller government or a liberal who believes in a bigger government, you have to make sure that government is also thinking not only about its size, but how oriented toward the future it is. And there are a set of future-oriented things that the private sector just doesn't tend to do enough of on its own. Build schools, invest in basic research. And the reason why Eisenhower was able to be the general who oversaw the World War II victory was not because he was a great tactician. He wasn't. He was a very good leader of people. But he understood the reason why we had won the war was because our productive might absolutely swamped the productive might of Japan and Germany. And he understood that it happened because of this coalition that included both the private sector and the public sector. And he basically took those lessons and applied them to his presidency. I do think he's underrated.
Could you comment on the role Philip Randolph, along with Bayard Rustin, played in 1963 March on Washington?
Yes. So first of all, Bayard Rustin, is the movie about him out or soon to be out? So one of the things I love about the 1941 March on Washington is after Roosevelt agreed to integrate the wartime factories, but not integrate the military, Bayard Rustin said, who was basically an aide to A. Philip Randolph, said, oh, well, we still need to go ahead with our march. We didn't get both our goals. And A. Philip Randolph said, are you crazy? Like, we just faced down the President of the United States, and we got him to integrate wartime factories. We're not humiliating him by having our march. We'll fight another day on integrating the military. And they did fight another day, and you'll see a photo, I think in my book. Did it make the cut? I'm asking one of my editors, who's also my wife. There's a photo of A. Philip Randolph demonstrating at the 1948 Democratic Convention about integrating the military, and so they did have that fight. So the March on Washington of 1941 doesn't happen. But 22 years later, they decide that executive orders, like the ones that had integrated the wartime factories and had integrated the military, which Truman issued, were not enough. That they also needed Congress to pass laws, civil rights laws, to extend legal equality to all Americans. And so they reanimated the idea they had had in 1941. They used the same name, the March on Washington. And Philip Randolph was the first speaker that day at the March on Washington. And I think it's notable for another reason. For anyone who's tempted to say that the American dream was always a joke or was always oversold, the most famous protest speech in American history and maybe world history was given that day in 1963 on the March on Washington. It's all a riff on the American dream. Martin Luther King says, I have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. And if you want to wonder whether that idea still has resonance, the country that is trying to displace our country as the world's biggest power is, of course, China. And when Xi Jinping took over the Chinese Communist Party, what was one of the first things that he said? He said, we are going to start a Chinese dream of common prosperity, completely riffing off the idea of an American dream. I do still think the American dream is a concept that is very powerful for large numbers of people.
I agree, and gets to my point, adding to your narrative about for whom the dream is still alive, and it's in the industry of higher education here. It's not really well known, but in all 50 states, we now have over 1 million international students studying in the United States, and we are still the largest point of entry for those students in the world. We have a lot of competition of late in Australia, and it shifts a bit from year to year. But those million students contribute over $30 billion to our economy. That money is distributed in all 50 states. And so, I mean, it's a contemporary, that number has risen annually, COVID, with the exception of the COVID years, for decades now. It's a very expansive industry. Those people are the ones who stay here after their studies and contribute to all aspects of our economy. It's just not talked about outside of our industry. I'm someone who spent 40 years in that industry, so it's taken for granted, I think, in many ways in the narrative of success in the U.S. You know, where is the American dream alive? It's definitely alive for all those families who save up, because these million students get no financial aid to study here. They have to pay for it themselves.
I mean, immigrants are the great exception to the fading of the American dream over the last several decades. I actually think if we're thinking about our economy as having too high inequality, which I would argue it does, I think an immigration policy that's a little more focused on admitting immigrants who are going to compete for jobs higher up the income spectrum is probably a better policy, right? One of the ways to reduce inequality is to have more labor competition for higher income workers than for lower income workers. And those kinds of students who you talk about are effectively competing more for jobs with higher income students in a way that I think is actually quite healthy.
I want to bring this question back to unions and also globalization. So again, I want to first indicate my support for the UAW and for the Star Talks workers, et cetera. However, my father, who was an ILGWU member, was destroyed, really, by the globalization of the clothing manufacturing business. And I want to ask you to comment on the tension between union gains in the United States and the globalization of manufacturing and other industries.
So as I alluded to before, I do think there's some really healthy questioning of globalization in this country. I mentioned before that I think some of the promises of the Reagan administration, if you go back and see how well they've borne out, have not been well borne out. I would say the same thing about the promises about global trade made by members of both parties. Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, they basically said, if we expand trade in this country, it'll make us richer and China freer. Hasn't worked out so well. And it has made China a lot richer, and I actually think we should celebrate that. It's been one of the largest reductions of human poverty in recorded history. That's a very big deal. But it's really hard to see ways in which it's benefited huge numbers of Americans. I'm not sure cheap iPhones benefits huge numbers of Americans. If you look at the kind of measures of human flourishing in many of the communities that have been most affected by trade, these are not communities that are healthy right now. Two things, though. One, I do think there's real reflection on this. I think we see, not just from Donald Trump, but also from President Biden, more reflection about what ways in which trade shouldn't be free, but it should actually be checked in different ways. And that's not a stark divide within the administration. You see it from the more progressive members of the administration, and you see it from Gina Raimondo, who's considered one of the more moderate members of the administration. But Secretary Raimondo doesn't talk about trade the way people in the Clinton administration did. And I think that's a healthy development. The second thing is specifically about unions. People sometimes said, well, wait a second, can we still have unions in this globalized world? Won't companies just move to Alabama or to Mexico or to Vietnam? And there's some of those issues, but there's still enormous advantages in manufacturing things for companies in the United States. And then the second thing to remember is we are increasingly becoming a service economy. And you don't have to have that worry with service jobs. A local hospital can't move to Alabama or Vietnam. A local Amazon warehouse can't move to Alabama or Vietnam. It can't serve us if it's in another place. A local Starbucks can't move. And so I actually think in an economy that is more service-oriented, there is in some ways greater potential for labor unions to organize.
Hi, I had a comment and a question. Well, maybe the first comment is actually a question too. You changed what Philip Randolph said when he called mass a mass movement, and you called it a political movement. And I was thinking that they're both related to each other rather than changing names, because you can't have a political movement or a power movement without a mass movement. So the mass movement comes first in educating people and helping them speak up, and then they get organized by some leaders or whatever to become a political movement.
I agree.
And that's the first thing. The second thing, I was concerned just because of, on my way here, my wife called and said, tell me when you get there because I want to be sure you're safe. And I think that question has to do with violence in the United States and anti-Semitism. And one of the things that I think you didn't mention at all was the role of guns and violence in our history.
Yes.
I mean, if you can it may be easier to get rid of a mass movement if you can kill JFK, RFK, and MLK in a 10-year period. That's a good way to get rid of a mass movement. I remember when in 1970, I was a resident in psychiatry in Boston, and Kent State happened. I remember saying, I don't know if I'm going to go and protest again, because they're going to shoot us.
Yeah. No, I mean, first of all, I had a long-running debate with my late father in which he was often worrying about anti-Semitism returning in the United States and was worrying about authoritarianism in the United States. And I said, oh, come on, Dad. It's all going to be fine. And I am more anxious about both of those subjects than I ever thought I would be in my entire life as an adult in this country. And so I think it is important to be very concerned about both of those issues. I think we know, it's been documented again and again and again, that having fewer guns leads to fewer gun deaths, right? The relationship is remarkably close. And so I would welcome any law that reduced the spread of guns in this country. I do think that it's important to talk about in ways that doesn't come off as alienating to large numbers of Americans, and not just to point to the statistics saying, well, everyone's in favor of more gun control, right? If everyone was actually in favor of more gun control, I don't think the politicians who are against it would keep winning elections again and again and again and would pay no price for it. And so I just think it's important to reflect on the fact that for many, many Americans, guns are an important part of their culture, and talking about it in a way that doesn't alienate them is actually the route to better gun control policies.
So we have 3 more questions. So and I apologize for those of you I might not get to. David, I know we'll be signing books, and perhaps after that, if there is time, but we will continue the conversation.
I have a question about the role that you see higher education, the cost of higher education is so extraordinary. Even in like medical school, it's excluding a whole segment of the population. If those prices came down, if more people could go to 4-year colleges, to go to medical school, how do you see that impacting us getting a movement? I keep thinking that if more diverse people were going to college, we'd have a different movement.
There has been a widening divide in who goes to and who graduates college, exactly along the lines that you mentioned. It's part of the widening class divide. Graduating from college is still a really good thing to do in our society. It doesn't guarantee you a good life, but nothing guarantees you a good life. And so I think that's a really important question. This is slightly technocratic, but actually at our nation's selective colleges, right? And I don't just mean A. Philip Randolph's non-alma mater of Harvard, at several dozen, a couple hundred selective colleges. Actually, there still is very generous financial aid for lower income people. There really is. And so to me, the problem is instead how hard it is to graduate from the colleges, not the 200 best colleges in America, according to most rankings, but the less selective colleges where large numbers of working class people go, where the graduation rates are really shamefully low often. And so often you'll read, I'll offer my own media critique, and the loans, often you'll read kind of in the media about like the barista with $80,000 in debt. That's not actually the biggest problem. The biggest problem is the student with $9,000 in debt who went to a year and a half of college and didn't graduate. And so to get at what you're saying, I think we need to focus on not the University of Maryland and not the prestigious private colleges, but the colleges that are actually enrolling the largest numbers of working class students.
I want to give you a chance to riff on a subject that is close to what you've been part of what you've been talking about and relates closely to the optimism, probably to a greater degree, at least in the public mind, than since the 1930s. We now have a arguably genuinely autocratic movement, or yes, autocratic philosophies that have become fairly widespread in the US have become dominant in Hungary or Turkey, pick a country, Brazil potentially. And does that not, or does it, temper your optimism? And what is your thinking on how one deals with those kinds of things? Because after all, if the solution is mass movements, mass power, beliefs and activities that are designed specifically to blunt the ability of such movements and power to emerge become a very fundamental threat.
Yes. So I am less optimistic than I would have been without the emergence of that movement. I think it's very important to try to keep separate different issues, right? Which is, to me, people who oppose democracy and refuse to participate in the peaceful transfer of power and who lie about election results, it's very hard. It's very, very hard to kind of find compromise on that issue, if that makes sense, right? But there are most issues in our society, it really is possible to find compromise on. And I think it's important for people who are deeply alarmed about the rise of authoritarian in this country to ask the question, how can we bring more people over to our side? How can we create a larger coalition so that an authoritarian movement doesn't win? And one of the things that I worry about is the authoritarian movement is definitely on the right in this country. Sometimes there are authoritarian movements on the left, but it's on the right in this country. And to say that clearly, this is not an equal problem of authoritarianism on the right and left in this country. It is a right-wing problem. But for that to be defeated by people in the center and on the left, I think it's important to be reflective about what parts of your side's message, I don't mean yours, sir, but that side's are alienating to people. And I think the political left in our country has come up with a very long list of issues in which they say, if you disagree with us on any of these, you're ignorant or hateful, right? If you are in favor of voter ID, you're ignorant or hateful. Really? A lot of democracies in the world have voter ID laws. That seems like something we should be able to debate. Right? You could disagree with me, but I'm not even saying I'm in favor of it or against it. But shouldn't we be able to debate voter ID? What about border security? Japan and South Korea have vastly tougher immigration laws than we do. Is that because they're ignorant and hateful? Seems like we should be able to debate that. And to me, there's now a list of 8 or 10 or 12 things in which the left in this country has said, if you disagree with us, it's because you're ignorant. It's because you don't understand your own interests. It's because you're hateful. I think that's empirically wrong on many of those issues. And I think it's really bad political strategy to say you're ignorant and hateful, please vote for us.
I'd like to expand a bit on your concept of democratic capitalism. I think you're right on target that we need to do something about the people who are left behind in general prosperity of America. But I'm a bit concerned about your democratic capitalism, that it leaves space for the market economy to function, to allocate resources. Could you elaborate on this, please?
Look, I think it's very important to say that capitalism is still the best system we have for spreading mass prosperity, right? I mean, I don't think I have to review the evidence of that, but look at North Korea versus South Korea, right? Look at the breadlines of the Soviet Union versus the mass prosperity of the United States. Look at the fact that China didn't start to become rich until it moved more toward capitalism. And so the market plays an absolutely vital role in providing most goods and services in our society, full stop. But most and all, there's still a lot of room in between those two. And I think it's similarly important to reflect on the fact that as the United States has moved more toward a laissez-faire economy, it has worked less well for most people. And I know, I talk to, some of them are my friends, I talk to economists and other people who say, well, that's just because in the 1980s, Reagan didn't really try laissez-faire capitalism. Which reminds me a little bit of the defenders of the Soviet Union who say it didn't really try Marxism, and if only it had, everything would have been great. The United States moved more toward laissez-faire capitalism than any other country, and we have the lowest life expectancy of any rich country. And so, to me, it is important to say that the market is phenomenally important in providing most goods and services. I don't think the government should be setting airline schedules and deciding the fares on each route. But I also think a society where we've ended up with relatively little regulation and very low tax rates for wealthy people relative to history is one that just hasn't worked very well for most people, the same way you can go too far toward constraining the market and also having it not work for people.
So what are the essentials of democratic capitalism?
What are the essentials? I think the set of things that that the market won't do on its own to invest in the future. So the market will not do enough to educate children for the future. The government needs to do that. The market also often won't do enough to invest in basic science because basic science is very expensive for individual companies. It's actually relatively cheap for the government compared with many other programs. When you're doing basic science, you can't always know who it's going to benefit in the end. So if you're a car company spending tons of money on basic science, it might benefit you. It might undercut one of your main products, or it might just end up benefiting some other industry entirely. And I think that's part of the reason why government does too little basic science. So I think it's a mix of investing in the future, taxing people so that we don't have wealth that basically builds up over many generations, making it possible for people to be able to bargain for their wages, which tends to be collective bargaining, I think it's a set of things like that. And then it's the whole set of things that come under tragedy of the commons, right? The market left to its own devices isn't going to solve climate change, because for any individual company, it's often profitable to worsen climate change. And their job is to make a profit, not to fix climate change. It's someone else's job to fix climate change.
So I want to thank David. And while we know you don't have a crystal ball, we also know that there are certainly, in particularly towards the end of your book, you give us a little bit of an idea of the ways in which there are those little beacons of hope, whether it's the number of states that have voted for to raise the minimum wage and that commitment that we know is there, and to build on that. And I would encourage you certainly to buy the book. It's outside, and David will be happy to sign. But also to continue this conversation and encourage, if you're not already subscribing to The Morning, I think it's free. You don't have to be a subscriber. It is free, right? And these are really important conversations for us to be having now, to be having them in this space, and to continue those conversations going forward. So I'm really thrilled, David, to have had you as our first speaker this year. We usually alternate between the types of speakers. It just happens that our next Amram Scholar Series speaker is also a journalist from the New York Times. It was just by the coincidence of dates, but the topic will be very different. On December 3rd, Adam Goldman will be here, and one of the things that he will be sharing is an exclusive conversation about and sharing about his recent travels in the aftermath of the Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7th. So he'll be here on December 3rd, and we hope that you will join us then.
Adam is great. You should all come. We were just at a wedding with Adam's wife. He wasn't there because he was reporting in Israel. So yeah.
So he has safely returned and is going to share with us then and talk about some of the other aspects of that he has reported on that help us understand the world in this moment. David, you've certainly helped us understand the world in this moment, our country in this moment. And as we go forward, we look forward to continuing to learn from you and with you. And it'll be interesting a little bit over a year from now to be looking at where we are and whether any of the predictions and suggestions that people have had have come to fruition. So thank you for
having me. Thanks for all the great questions.